We're almost there. This is the last video about this dress. In the previous video, I showed you how I sewed the bodice. In this video, you'll see how I sewed the skirt and put it all together. First, I want to flatline my skirt pieces, but before that, I'm thinking ahead now. I've used a 1-inch strip of tricot interfacing at center back where the zipper will be. I'm not putting the zipper right at the center back seam, I'm putting it at the back darts. And I'll start the pleat under the zipper. So I've pinned the edges except for the bottom, and I'm going to sew them together. I did this for the front skirt and the 2 back skirt pieces. Now I'm going to cut my pocket facings. I didn't think I would use the laser cut spandex because of the holes in it, but the fusing has worked really well, so I decided to cut the facings out of fusible tricot, fuse it to the laser cut spandex, and cut the facings out that way. To attach the facings to the pockets, I'm doing it a little different from the pattern instructions. Surprise, surprise! I marked out where the facing edge hits on the pocket, then marked in a 1/2 inch, double the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I can line up the facing to the line, sew it a 1/4 inch, and then fold it over for a nice clean edge. Then I top stitched it down close to the edge. The pocket bags with facings get sewn onto the back skirt panels. I match the notches, and because I cut the skirt down for the belt, my pockets hang over the top a little. Then press the seam allowance toward the pocket. The pocket bags with no facings are sewn to the front skirt, matching the notches, and then pressed toward the pocket too. Then I lined up the edges of the side seams and stitched just a little at the top, leaving the pocket open, and stitched the rest of the side seam down. Then I stitched the pocket bags together. I want to press the side seams open, so I snipped under the pocket bag so the seam can lay flat. Then I pressed it open with a press cloth. At the pocket, I want the side seams to just butt up against each other. Now I'm pinning the pleats together. I'm not going to sew them down with little L's, I'm only going to sew across the top to hold them. I'm stopping at the side seam to move the pocket back because I don't want to sew through those just yet. After the pleats are sewn, I spread the skirt on the table and pinned the pockets where they laid nicely. I held it up to make sure it wasn't pulling anywhere funny, then stitched the pockets at the top of the skirt. Now I want to insert the invisible zipper. The first thing I do is iron it open. I unzip it, and from the back side I roll the teeth flat and press each side. This will make it easier to sew close to the teeth. I'm marking the edge of the pleat that I'm using as center back, and pinning the zipper in place on both sides. I always double check to make sure I've pinned it so that it opens correctly. I'm using an invisible zipper foot to sew it onto the skirt, but you can also use a regular zipper foot. I prefer this foot because I can sew the zipper in the same direction, so from the top to the bottom on both sides of the zipper. You'll get a more even feed this way. Now here's the critical part to getting a nice invisible zipper. You have to use a zipper foot at the edge in order to get close enough to the zipper end and close up the seam. I have the fabric pulled right up next to the zipper to sew just a few inches to hide the bottom of the zipper in this pleat. Now I'm sewing the center back starting around where the zipper ends. I'm using a press cloth to press the zipper flat and press the center back seam open. I'm cutting away the extra fabric that was originally going to be a pleat at the center back, and I cut straight across the pleat so I can center it over the zipper and pin the pleat. Then sew it closed. So here is the back with the invisible zipper and pleat under. I'm measuring the front waist to prepare the leather waistband. I cut the front waistband to fit the front skirt, and stitch the other 2 waistband pieces to the sides and press them open. I like to trim away the seam allowance where I'm going to have another seam, so it's not so bulky. Now I'm pinning or clipping the skirt and waistband together. I stitch the skirt onto the waistband, using the stitching from the pleats as a guide, and then check to make sure it lines up perfectly at the zipper. I've already sewn the bodice shell fabrics to the lining fabric at the waistline. This makes it easier to pin into the waistband. I match the center and pin out from there. Then sew the bodice onto the waistband. Onto the skirt lining. I've serged the edges, and now I'm pinning the center back. I'm leaving the bottom open for a slit and the top open for the zipper, so just a small section of the center back gets sewn. Then I press the center back open. Even the parts I didn't sew get a 1/2 inch pressed back. At the side seams, I'm pinning along the suggested stitch line to check the fit before I sew. It seemed a little tight when I sat down, so I repinned to use the extra seam allowance I gave myself. The pattern calls for an easing stitch at the front, so I stitched a line and pulled the bobbin thread until the front lining could ease into the rest of the dress. I also marked and stitched the back darts at this point. After pressing the darts, I pinned the waistband lining onto the skirt lining and stitched them together. Then I pressed the seam allowance up. Time to pin the waistbands together. I double check to make sure it's going to turn back the correct way, and then pin the rest of the way around the waistband. At the back, I trim the waistband excess to 1 inch past the zipper. This will give me enough room for a snap. I'm going to start sewing at one edge of the zipper, around the corners, the length of the waistband, the other corners, and end right at the other side of the zipper. Then I snipped away the bulk from the corners and used a point turner to push the corners out nice and square. I'm pinning everywhere that I can to get the seams to fold up into the waistband. I want to sew a 1/4 inch at the edge of the leather waistband to control the seams. Now I've pinned the lining onto the zipper and I'm hand sewing it in place. I also stitched around the back slit and stitched a 1/2 inch hem in the lining. To do the binding at the hem of the dress, I put it on a dress form so it hangs freely. You could just put it on a hanger if you don't have a mannequin. I'm pinning along the sweep of the dress, a few inches above the edge. You can see how much farther the spandex is hanging past the satin. I also want to shorten the length 1 inch, so I mark that on the satin and stitch the two fabrics together a 1/2 inch above the mark. I'm trimming away the extra fabric because it needs to be cut at the finished edge for the binding. Here are my 2-inch bias strips for the binding. I want one continuous piece, so I'm going to join the edges. I want to keep the end angled like this because it's on the straight grain. The second piece comes over it at a 90-degree angle like this and gets sewn with these points sticking out. I'm pressing the seam open and then trimming away the little points. Now I can run the bias through a 1-inch binding maker. This satin is a little slippery in there, so it's taking a little finagling. Then I fold it almost in half. I'm going to stitch in the ditch, so I want at least a 1/16 inch difference. Now I've opened the binding back up and I'm pinning the shorter of the folded sides to the skirt hem. I'm being careful not to stretch the binding as I pin it in. When I sew it, I'm starting just below the actual sew line, so I can cover that starting point later. I'm sewing just to the right of the fold. When I get all the way around the skirt, back to where I started, I cut the binding a little longer than I need and fold it back to where I want it to meet the start of the binding. I'm folding the binding over and using wonder clips to hold it in place. The binding was folded slightly longer in the back, so it should extend a little past the stitch line. I'm going to stitch in the ditch so you don't see the thread and it looks really clean. After it's sewn, I see that I missed the binding in a few places. I'm going to hand sew those little spots instead of restitching. Now I need to put the snap at the back of the waistband. I have a kick press from Gold Star Tool and it's pretty awesome. So I've already punched the holes for the snaps, and I'm using the dies for the kick press and a 24-line black enamel snap. And the last thing is the little spider. It was a necklace, and I used dikes to cut off the hole for the chain and diamond sharpeners to sand down the sharp edge from that. I'm hand sewing the spider onto the yoke. And done. Well, this dress has been much more complicated than I intended, so thank you for hanging in there with me. I hope these videos inspire you to try new things in your own sewing. Break the rules, use weird fabric and trims, experiment. F*** it, if you make mistakes, you're gonna learn how to problem solve. So, as always, if you've enjoyed these videos, please give them a like and subscribe to my channel. For my next project, I will try to do something simpler. I'll try, but it will involve sequins.